Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another read-along discussion for my current ongoing 12-month read-along of Anthony Powell's amazing series, A Dance to the Music of Time. Today I'm going to be talking about the fifth book in the series, Casanova's Chinese Restaurant. As usual with these read-along videos, this video will be spoilery for the series up until this point and for this book as well. But hopefully if you're watching this you have read the book and are joining in with the read-along, so let's go. So this is the fifth book in the series and one I really enjoyed. I'm having such a great experience rereading this series or listening to them on audiobook because it's been quite a long time since I read them and I don't remember them that well. It's weird because the sensation of this series stayed with me over a long time. I remembered how the books made me feel, I remembered how much I enjoyed the series, I remembered certain scenes and characters brilliantly, and then other things I've just completely forgotten, and I have weird moments of deja vu as I read. I had forgotten the existence of Hugh Morland, who is one of the main characters in this book, or at least I think perhaps I had put him and Stringham together in my head and almost combined them. I don't know. And for example, things like about 3 sentences before McClintock's suicide, I remembered that McClintock committed suicide. And there are moments when I just suddenly remember things and get that sense of deja vu, but actually a lot of it feels very fresh and new to me because it's been, 7 or 8 years since I read the series, and I read them all in quite quick succession, so I don't remember what happens in which books, and I kind of remembered certain key events. I will do today what I usually do in these videos. I will quickly go through a brief introduction to the plot in this book, talk about some of the things I really enjoyed, talk about some of the particular characters, and then talk about some of the particular themes. So Casanova's Chinese Restaurant mostly takes place in the kind of mid to late mid 1930s, although the first sort of chapter of the book does take place partly in the 1920s, and we have a kind of flashback to the time of a buyer's market, which is the second book in the series, and we meet once more Mr. Deacon and Barnaby, and we're also introduced to another good friend of Nick's, Hugh Morland, who is in a way the focal point of this book, I would say. We learn a little bit about Morland, we meet some of his friends, including McClintock and Corello, and later Nick, Barnaby, Morland and McClintock go out to dinner together at Casanova's Chinese Restaurant. And we follow Nick's relationship with Morland briefly through Nick meeting Matilda, a woman that Morland wants to marry, and we learn at the end of the first chapter that Hugh does go on to marry Matilda around the same time that Nick is married to Isabel. In the second chapter we witness a Sunday lunch at Nick's in-laws in which it is mostly family, and then they've also invited St. John Clark, a novelist who was also incredibly central to A Buyer's Market, interestingly, the second book, as I've already spoken about, and St. John Clark in that book was sort of ever-present but never actually met, and this is the first time in the book series that we see him, and he then passes away by the end of the novel. After Sunday lunch with his in-laws, Nick goes to visit Isabel, who is in hospital or in a nursing home where she's been because she's just had a miscarriage, and he also again meets Morland there, whose wife is also there as she is having a baby, and they also run into Woodverpool, who is there for various medical reasons of his own. On the way out of the nursing home, Morland invites Nick to come to supper at the McClintock's household. Mr. and Mrs. McClintock, who have a terrible married life and shout at each other a lot, really seem to hate each other, and it's very awkward for all concerned and for all who are there for supper. At the beginning of the third chapter we learn that Hugh and Matilda have had their child and that the child has died after a few hours, and see a little bit of how this affects their marriage. Indeed, later on in the chapter we attend a party for Hugh Morland's new symphony, and Nick is very surprised to find, coming along to the concert and the party at Mrs. Fox's afterwards, Charles Stringham's mother from previous books, he's very surprised to find his sister-in-law Priscilla has been invited, and that Priscilla and Hugh Morland seem to be having an affair, or at least some kind of relationship. Nick isn't exactly sure, Matilda, Hugh's wife, isn't exactly sure, but Nick is quite uncomfortable about the whole business. At this party, at this symphony party at Mrs. Fox's, Charles Stringham turns up again, proceeds to flirt a lot with Mrs. McClintock, behave very oddly, and ends up getting taken home by his mother's former secretary, Miss Tuffy, and everything kind of goes a little bit wrong. And then in the fourth and final chapter of the book, we learn that McClintock's wife has left him, has run off with Corello, another friend of McClintock's and Morland's, who was living with the McClintocks while low on money, and McClintock has also lost his job. He's in a very bad state when Nick and Morland go and see him, and we learn at the very end of the book that McClintock has committed suicide. It's really interesting describing the plot of a novel from within A Dance to the Music of Time, because I barely have to mention Nick's name, even though he is the narrator and he is our point of view character and it's his perspective and analysis we get. Actually, he is very passive in the plot, and I think within the first few novels he's a bit more active in the plot, and then the further we go into the series, starting especially from Our Lady Molly's and this one, we learn less and less about Nick's kind of private personal life, and we learn much more about the people around him, and it becomes even more observational, and kind of Nick as a character sort of withdraws a bit. And I think this is partly because of the fact that Anthony Powell was writing from the perspective of a character who was quite like himself. We know that A Dance with the Fuse of Time was at least kind of partially autobiographical, and certainly the fact that Isabella's character is not written about very much and not analysed, I think is a kind of mark of respect towards his wife, who Isabel is supposed to be based off. We know at the very beginning of the book that Isabel has just had a miscarriage, but it takes us a little while to learn that. Nick doesn't directly tell it to us. He mentions it in dialogue with another character. It takes us quite a few pages from knowing that Isabel is in a nursing home to finding out why, and Nick makes no comment on it. And it's always sort of too personal to the narrator, and this book is not about Nick as a narrator, it's about all the people around him and his perspectives of them, which is one of the things I love about the book, which I suppose is what I'm talking about now. I really, really love the way that Anthony Powell does that, and the weird sort of odd position that Nick has as a narrator. It's a technique you find in some 19th century novels such as Wuthering Heights or Cranford, where the narrator is not really the main character, and it's something I really, really enjoy. It's just a technique I really, really love, and I think that becomes more and more the case throughout A Dance with the Fuse of Time. Obviously Nick is very, very important. In seeing the way he analyses people, we do see quite a lot of himself, but also it's kind of not about him, or not about his life so much as about his observations and the people around him and the world around him. It's interesting though, because although Nick is the narrator but not the main character, we also don't entirely know that much about all of the other characters, and this kind of indirect storytelling that you get throughout A Dance with the Fuse of Time is something I really like. For example, Hugh Morland is, in a way, the main character here. He is one of the focuses in this book, and his relationship with Priscilla, with Nick's sister-in-law, we know that something is going on, and Nick kind of knows what's going on, and we kind of get the start of that relationship and then the end of that relationship when, after McClintock's suicide, Hugh decides to break it off with Priscilla and continue life with his wife. And we kind of get that all from a distance. Nick is never really sure what's going on, Matilda doesn't really know what's going on, Hugh doesn't talk to Nick about it, and we kind of get this story that's going on in the background of the book. Nick is not our main character, we don't know everything about his life, but nor do we know everything about the lives of all the people he's observing. It's just a really different and interesting technique, and that's one of the things I love about the series, is just how different they are. Another thing I really enjoy about this is how it kind of slips back and forward in time. To me, the series always feels really, really smooth in the way that it kind of effortlessly slips between time. It should feel weird that the first chapter of this book is set in the late 1920s, like back in the time of A Buyer's Market, which was several books ago, and the rest of it is set after the last book in the 1930s. It should feel odd, but for some reason it doesn't, because it still feels kind of coherent, and because the books are chronological, yes, but also kind of thematic too, I suppose. I also really love the references back to A Buyer's Market throughout the book, not just in the first chapter, which takes place at the same time, but also the references to Mr. Deacon and people connected with him, such as Norman Chandler, who we didn't meet before, but we know from the beginning of this book is connected to Mr. Deacon, and also the references to St. John Clark, who I already mentioned, which is really, really interesting. I also really like how music operates in this book. It's interesting how in A Dance with the Fuse of Time, sort of all the books are concerned with art in various different ways, and literature and kind of novel writing and analysis of people and how that feeds into writing is quite an important theme throughout. But we have some books which are much more focused on art, and then this is one which is much more focused on music as an art form, and acting, I suppose, to a certain extent as well, in comparison to, for example, A Buyer's Market. I also think there is a slight turn in tone in this book. Obviously we have looked at some serious things in the first few books of the series, such as Charles Stringham's alcoholism and a lot of breaking up of marriages, but McClintock's suicide is potentially the darkest thing that has happened in the series so far, and quite abruptly shifts the tone of this book in a way. But similarly, early on in this book, we do have other sadnesses. We have Nick and Isabel's miscarriage, we have Matilda and Hugh's child dying. This book is distinctly darker, I would say, than the earlier ones in the series, and as we are getting into the late 1930s, and we know as readers from the modern time, and you know, people reading these books in the 50s and 60s when they were published would have known the war is coming up quite soon. We have a lot of background echoes of what's going on in Europe and the world as a whole, talk about the Spanish Civil War and Hitler, and we kind of know that in a few books' time we'll be in the Second World War. And so I do think that kind of shift in tone is quite important here. There are a few particular characters I want to talk about in this book. I don't want to go into too much depth with these because I feel like I've already spoken quite a lot about the things that I love about this book, but there are a few new characters in this book which are quite interesting to look at, and there is one old character who returns who I want to talk about, which is Charles Stringham. Charles Stringham is one of my favourite characters, but I find it really interesting the points at which he shows up and doesn't show up, and also the way in which he works as a character. When we saw him at school as a friend that Nick really looked up to, he seemed to have an awful lot of power. And we see him in this book diminish, but also not exactly diminish, because he is still incredibly funny. Like, I love Charles Stringham dialogue. He is one of my favourite characters to read, one of my favourite characters in the whole book and in the whole series. You know, I said that I've forgotten a lot of this series, but often Charles Stringham's words, like, I remember random things he says, even though I don't remember the context of them, from when my first reading, when I was like 17, 18, because he is such a staggeringly kind of realised, brilliant character. You know that Charles Stringham is an alcoholic, that he is struggling in life, that he is kind of kept watch over by and looked after by Tuffy, Miss Whedon, his mother's old secretary. We know that he is struggling, but we also know that he has enough together to randomly turn up at this party and make everyone think he's just a bit eccentric and kind of charm everyone, because he is charming. One of the most sort of vivid scenes in this book is the moment where Miss Whedon turns up at the party and tries to get Stringham to come home, persuading him in ways that show her power over him, but not everyone else realises except for Nick, who is really, really aware of how little power Charles has in this kind of odd dynamic that there is between Charles and Miss Whedon. So it's really, really sad in many ways, but really, really interesting. I think he's such a fascinating character. In terms of some of the newer characters who are introduced in this book, Hugh Morland is a really, really interesting character. I think there is something of Stringham in Hugh Morland, and Nick at one point does say this. He says that they are quite different but also have some things in common. Hugh is an interesting figure. His music is incredibly important to him. He kind of struggles in his relationships with women, is in love with Matilda but also potentially with Priscilla, and we see the way kind of settling down into a conventional married life is difficult for him, and how he believes that having a child with Matilda will kind of fix everything, except when that child dies and it makes things worse. We see the way that he cares deeply for his friends, and Nick comments in particular on the way that nothing except for a deep love for McClintock could have brought Hugh to go and see him just after McClintock's marriage has broken up, and McClintock is in such a bad way, because Hugh is not that kind of person except where he loves deeply. I want to talk a little bit about St. John Clarke, because I think he is an interesting character, and interesting too that after having not met him over so many years, he finally turns up in this book, despite being mentioned at great length in A Buyer's Market. And St. John Clarke is in a way not quite what you expect after having heard so much about him, and he seems someone torn between a kind of old and new world, torn between the way he used to talk about things and the kind of sentimentalism of his novels with his kind of new revolutionary standpoint that every now and then he forgets to drop into conversation. We also have the odd way that St. John Clarke feels about this kind of responsibility over Eridge's money affairs, the fact that he's both kind of proud to be part of it but also annoyed that he might be brought into contact with Quiggin, and also worried that Lady Warminster will think badly of him for it. He also wants to be the centre of attention, and his role as a writer is quite interesting. I really like the part at the lunch party where Nick is kind of slightly uncomfortable to be in the same room as St. John Clarke, because they both are writers. They both have more in common with each other than anyone else in the room, but also Nick considers himself a very, very different kind of writer, and it's part of his kind of current ways of viewing literature to view St. John Clarke's novels with quite a bit of disdain. I also want to talk about Mr. and Mrs. McClintock, because I think they're quite interesting characters. We see a lot of marriages break up, and we see a lot of marriages on the rocks, but there is the marriage that we witness within so far of A Dance to the Music of Time that is so utterly badly prepared, and where they both seem to despise each other so much, where they both are so horrible to each other and seem so completely unhappy and wretched within each other's company. McClintock is often very, very rude to his wife, and she is very rude to him and about him, and also takes great pleasure in talking to Charles Stringham and having like a handsome man to talk to who is not her husband, and to kind of talk about how awful her husband is too. McClintock is a very interesting figure because he is not a very likeable man. Throughout the book he is rough and rude and sexist and very dismissive of other people, but we also see that Hugh Morland, who is a much more likeable person, really likes him, and have to try and understand why. And also the ending with McClintock is very, very moving. They go to his house and he starts telling them about how he met his wife and how drawn they were to each other. And we see in fact that his wife leaving him pushes him over the edge and makes him commit suicide, or at least that's part of it. His money troubles might be part of it too. He talks at the beginning of the book quite openly about how he thinks if he were to run out of money and not have a sustainable way of living, he would kill himself, which he does. But also you can see that there is a kind of love for his wife underneath all the anger and the bitterness of their relationship, that he misses her and that it destroys him. I want to talk a little bit about the themes in this book. Marriage, I think, is quite a big theme in here, both in terms of Nick and Isabel, though in the background this is the first book in which they are married for the bulk of it, and also in terms of Hugh and Matilda and the kind of struggles of their relationships, and also the difficulties about having children. Isabel and Nick have a miscarriage, and Hugh and Matilda's child is born and only lives a few hours. We see the strain that this puts on Hugh and Matilda's relationship, although we are not told about what strain it might have put on Nick and Isabel's. Similarly, the McClintocks are very important in this book as another picture of marriage, as are Mr. and Mrs. Fox. It's interesting to note how the position of kind of a third in 3 of these marriages operates. Hugh and Matilda's marriage is put under strain by the fact that Hugh is having some kind of relationship, even if it's just a flirtation, not an actual affair, with Priscilla. The tension between Mr. and Mrs. McClintock seems to heighten with having Corello as their lodger, and then Mrs. McClintock obviously runs off with Corello. But with Mr. and Mrs. Fox, Norman Chandler as some kind of odd third in their relationship seems to make them happier. Buster is really, really happy with the fact that his wife spends an awful lot of time with this young man, and Nick dwells in quite a lot of interesting depth on the relationship between Mrs. Fox and Norman Chandler. It suggested quite strongly that Norman Chandler is gay, and it suggested that the relationship between Norman Chandler and Mrs. Fox is nothing kind of romantic or sexual, but more of a kind of intense friendship with a lot of weird power dynamics at play. It's quite an interesting dynamic and quite interesting to explore kind of different forms of love. Nick says that yes, Mrs. Fox might not love Norman Chandler in a traditional, conventional way, but she does love him in some way. Throughout this book and throughout the series, we see portraits of very, very different marriages that operate in different ways. Leading on from Norman Chandler, I do want to talk a bit about sexuality and the way that's explored in this book. I think it's really interesting that Mr. Deacon crops up in both A Buyer's Market and here, in much greater length at A Buyer's Market, but it's only in Casanova's Chinese Restaurant that it's really made clear that Mr. Deacon is gay. I think at one point in Lady Molly's someone refers to him as like that old queen, but it's only really in Casanova's Chinese Restaurant that it's made pretty clear that Mr. Deacon is gay and sort of having various relationships with young men. And I do think it's quite interesting to look at the timing of this, because Mr. Deacon's sort of sexuality is not dwelt upon whatsoever in A Buyer's Market, like it's not even hinted at. I think that is partly to do with the timing. A Buyer's Market was published first in 1952 and Casanova's Chinese Restaurant was published in 1960. Decriminalisation of homosexuality in the UK was 1967, so still after this was published, but I do think you can see a kind of shift in attitudes of what was kind of more acceptable to write about by the time of Casanova's Chinese Restaurant. I want to talk a little bit, as I kind of always do, about social change and politics. Politics is something that tends to happen in the background, at least in the early books in A Dance to the Music of Time. There's a lot of discussion about the Spanish Civil War, about Eyrege's involvement there, and about how people on different sides think differently about things, who agrees with Franco, who agrees with the communists, who is left-wing and right-wing, and who in the centre. It's something that the McClintocks argue about quite a lot, and it's something that St. John Clarke brings up at lunchtime. Similarly, the abdication is something that runs throughout this book and is mentioned a lot as something that is constantly in the news and that a lot of people are talking about, and that Widmerpool is very, very, very sad about because he was sort of involved in social circles which he thought were going to make him much more important, but actually, after the abdication, do not. One of the things I love about the series is how it kind of interacts with British history in the time that each book is set, and how it follows a particular sort of long section of British 20th century history and kind of examines it, and it looks at how kind of big political events affect people's everyday lives and their relationships with each other, something I find really, really interesting. I think that's mostly what I wanted to talk about today in Casanova's Chinese Restaurant. I really, really enjoyed it, as I do with all the books in the series. And the next one in the series, number 6, is The Kindly Ones, which I sort of half remember. I thought I remembered it very well, and then Nick read it recently and we were talking about it, and I apparently only remember the first third. So there we go. I'm looking forward to reading this one. But thank you very much for watching. That is all for today. Please let me know down below if you read Casanova's Chinese Restaurant in July and if you enjoyed it, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.